In the winter of 1947, a county health inspector trudged through the frozen dirt roads of rural Kentucky. His name was Robert Mills, and the cabin he was about to enter would haunt him until the day he died. What Mills discovered inside wasn't just poverty. It wasn't just neglect. It was something no textbook or training manual had prepared him for. 3 generations of a single family crammed under one roof, but their family tree twisted and knotted into something unnatural. Brothers had married sisters. Cousins bore children with cousins. And at the center of it all stood 2 women, 2 sisters, whose private pact had created one of the most genetically devastated bloodlines ever recorded in American history. The inspector's report, filed, sealed, and buried in courthouse archives for over 70 years, contained details so horrific that local officials refused to let the public read it while they were still alive. But death loosens tongues, and old papers don't stay hidden forever. When those forgotten files resurfaced decades later, they revealed a nightmare that was no folklore, no backwoods rumor. These weren't ghost stories whispered around a campfire. These were real birth certificates, real hospital records, and real death certificates, all pointing to the same conclusion: this was a family destroyed from the inside out, by their own blood. The family's name was Whitlock. If you drive through that corner of Kentucky today, you might still hear the name in passing, though most locals pretend it doesn't exist. Down the old mining roads you'll find weathered stones, collapsed barns, and homesteads reclaimed by vines, places where their descendants once tried to live. The locals won't speak of it, but the courthouse records do. Those records tell us about Martha and Sarah Whitlock, 2 sisters whose bond was so deep, so codependent, that it defied every law of nature and society. The story begins in 1923, when Martha, only 19 years old, married a coal miner named Thomas Hadley. On the surface, it was the kind of ordinary Appalachian marriage you'd expect at the time, 2 young people trying to build a life in the shadow of the mines. But Martha carried a secret, one that would set her family on a 30-year spiral into genetic catastrophe. You see, Martha had made a promise to her younger sister, Sarah. Sarah was just 17, unmarried, and, according to letters discovered decades later, terrified of being left behind. The Whitlock sisters had grown up in extreme isolation. Their parents had been killed in a mining accident when they were children, and in the years that followed, Martha and Sarah became inseparable, bound together not only by blood, but by trauma, fear, and an almost suffocating dependency on each other. So when Martha announced her engagement to Thomas Hadley, Sarah broke down. She threatened to kill herself rather than be abandoned. She couldn't imagine life without her sister. And that's when Martha made the decision that doomed them all. She promised Sarah that Thomas would not just be her husband. He would be Sarah's husband too. What started as an act of compassion became the foundation for a nightmare. Medical records show that by 1924, both sisters were pregnant, at the same time. Both carried Thomas's children. To the outside world, the arrangement was hidden. Birth certificates were falsified. Records listed Martha as the mother of both babies, disguising the truth from prying eyes. But inside that remote cabin, the family began to live as a polygamous unit, 15 miles from the nearest town, bound by a pact no one dared expose. What Martha and Sarah didn't understand, what no one in their isolated hollow could have understood, was that Thomas Hadley wasn't just a random coal miner. He was their distant cousin. The sisters and their husband already shared great-grandparents, and in that union, they had unknowingly built the foundation for a genetic collapse. The children born in that cabin weren't just half-siblings. They were the products of multiple generations of intermarriage. The bloodline was already thin, and what little diversity it had left was being squeezed tighter with every birth. By 1930, the household had grown to 8 children, 4 officially Martha's, 4 officially Sarah's, though all bore the same father. To the children, the arrangement felt normal. They called both women Mama. They grew up under one roof, believing they had 2 mothers. But what they couldn't understand, what none of them would realize until much later, was that their bodies were already carrying the scars of a broken bloodline. The horror didn't reveal itself all at once. It crept in slowly, like a sickness you can't name. And it began with the oldest boy, James. But James's suffering was only the beginning. Because the curse of the Whitlocks was spreading through the bloodline, and the worst was yet to come. James Hadley was supposed to be the future of the family. The firstborn son. The one who would carry the name forward. But instead, he became the first warning sign that something was very, very wrong. At 12, James's body was already breaking. His seizures grew so violent that local doctors began making quiet notes in their ledgers, strange symptoms they couldn't quite explain. His spine curved unnaturally, his growth nearly frozen in time. By the age of 16, he looked like a 10-year-old boy trapped in a teenager's body. And James was only the beginning. Just months after he was born, Sarah had given birth to her daughter, Mary. From the moment she arrived, Mary bore the marks of the family pact. Doctors thought she had a cleft palate. But closer examinations revealed something worse. Her skull was misshapen, her eyes set too far apart, her hearing non-existent. Mary was completely deaf. Neighbors whispered. Churchgoers averted their eyes. And soon, the Whitlock-Hadley family did what desperate families always do when shame grows too heavy, they hid her away. Mary never attended church. She never walked down the dirt road to school. She spent her life in that cabin, shielded from outsiders, her malformed face locked away like a secret too dark for daylight. By 1935, 6 of the 8 Whitlock-Hadley children showed signs of severe genetic damage. 2 more had already died in infancy, their death certificates reading, failure to thrive. But the doctors who signed them later admitted, these weren't simple cases of bad luck. These were children born with organs that couldn't sustain life. And yet Martha and Sarah still didn't understand. Or maybe they refused to. Instead of seeing the truth, that their bloodline was collapsing, they convinced themselves the sickness came from outside forces. Evil spirits. Bad water. God's punishment for sins they hadn't yet confessed. Anything but the reality, that they themselves were the architects of this nightmare. By 1940, the bloodline had begun devouring itself. And what happened that year should have been impossible. James, the eldest son, severely disabled, barely functional, somehow fathered a child. With Mary, his half-sister. The girl born deaf, disfigured, and hidden. Her pregnancy nearly killed her. And the baby she bore would defy every expectation of what a human body could endure. The infant lived just 3 months. Born without fully formed lungs. Organs scattered in the wrong places. A brain so damaged it never achieved consciousness. The county coroner, Dr. William Patterson, recorded the case in his private notes. What he wrote would never make it into official records. He described the infant as, the most genetically compromised human being I have ever encountered in 30 years of practice. But that baby's death didn't end the family's experiment. It accelerated it. Because by then, Martha and Sarah had convinced themselves that keeping the bloodline pure was the only way to cleanse their family of suffering. And so, in the shadows of the Appalachian Hills, the sisters began urging their surviving children to marry one another. Brothers to sisters. Cousins to cousins. They believed they were fixing the problem. But they were only concentrating the damage. By 1942, 3 new children had been born within the cabin. None from outsiders. All from unions between half-siblings or cousins. And those children? They represented something America had never seen before. One child was born blind. Another, unable to walk, his legs bent at grotesque angles. A third with skeletal deformities so severe that doctors refused to believe the X-rays were real. His organs scrambled inside his body. His heart where the liver should be. His kidneys where his stomach belonged. And yet, somehow, he lived. For 2 agonizing years. Every breath a struggle. Every moment a reminder that this was no ordinary family, it was a laboratory of human collapse. Dr. Patterson's notes grew darker. He began to write not as a physician, but as a man losing his faith in humanity itself. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because what began in secrecy, 2 sisters sharing a husband, was about to explode into public view. And when it did, the state of Kentucky would uncover not just suffering, but a world so twisted it could no longer be ignored. By the early 1940s, the Whitlocks had passed the point of no return. The cabin wasn't just a home anymore, it had become an ecosystem of decay, where every child carried visible or hidden scars. Neighbors who once excused the family's oddities now crossed the road when they saw one of the children wandering near the tree line. Whispers grew sharper, the Whitlocks were cursed, unclean, maybe even less than human. Inside the cabin, Martha and Sarah refused to acknowledge those whispers. If anything, they grew more defiant. They convinced themselves that the suffering of their children was not evidence of collapse, but of divine testing. Every deformity, every seizure, every infant death was twisted into proof that God was shaping their family for a higher purpose. The sisters clung to that belief so tightly that it hardened into doctrine. By then, the older children had reached adolescence. Instead of being encouraged to leave, to marry outside the family, they were bound even tighter. Sarah and Martha began arranging pairings among their offspring, whispering promises that purity would save them. Brothers were told they would protect their sisters by wedding them. Cousins were matched like livestock. Those forced unions birthed a second generation inside the cabin, children who had no concept of a world beyond their walls. To them, deformity was normal. Disability was expected. The strange syllables they spoke to one another formed a private language outsiders could never understand. Medical records recovered years later describe one haunting case in particular, a boy born in 1943 whose skeleton failed to harden. His limbs bent under his own weight, leaving him to crawl across the floor on arms that bowed like willow branches. Yet even in agony, he survived longer than doctors believed possible. For the sisters, his survival was spun into vindication. They claimed it was proof their bloodline was stronger than outsiders realized. But survival did not mean salvation. By 1945, nearly every surviving child showed evidence of catastrophic genetic damage. And though rumors trickled into town, no one dared intervene. The Whitlocks had lived in isolation for decades. Poverty was common in the mountains, and most assumed the stories were exaggerated. That illusion shattered in the winter of 1947, when the county finally sent Robert Mills down the dirt road to investigate. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in years, and the dirt road leading to the Whitlock cabin had frozen solid, ruts locked into place like stone. The state convoy moved slowly, headlights bouncing across the skeletal trees. Deputies rode in the first trucks, followed by social workers, then a handful of doctors from Lexington who had been convinced, some reluctantly, that this case was worth their expertise. Few spoke during the ride. They had read Robert Mills's report, but no one quite believed it. Reports could exaggerate. Poverty could make things look worse than they were. Still, each man carried a knot of unease as the road narrowed into a corridor of pines. By the time they reached the clearing, smoke leaked weakly from the chimney. Windows were shuttered, doors barred from within. Deputies knocked, then shouted. Inside came only the muffled cries of children, a sound that didn't belong to any ordinary home. The words were indistinct, high-pitched syllables strung together in a rhythm the outsiders couldn't recognize. To one social worker it sounded almost like chanting. To another, like the calls of wounded animals. For 2 days the stalemate dragged on. Deputies circled the perimeter, calling through gaps in the boards, promising food, warmth, safety. From within, Martha and Sarah shouted back. Their voices, thin but unyielding, carried passages from scripture spliced with furious condemnations. They accused the men outside of serving the devil, of coming not to save children but to poison them. Any mention of medicine, of hospitals, was met with volleys of curses. At night, lanterns burned inside the cabin, shadows crossing slats in strange, jerking movements. The cries of the children rose and fell like the keening of wild dogs. On the second night, 2 young ones collapsed. Their frail bodies, weakened by years of hunger and sickness, couldn't survive the fear and deprivation of the standoff. By morning, their cries were gone, replaced by the heavy silence of death. Even the deputies hardened by years in the mines whispered to each other in dread. They had expected hunger, maybe beatings. They had not expected this. By the third night, the order came down from Frankfurt, the doors were to be forced. Deputies braced themselves, axes swinging, splintering through the barricades. The crash of breaking would echo across the frozen hollow. Inside, the air hit them like a wall. Years of unwashed bodies, rotting scraps of food, and stagnant waste combined into a stench so powerful some men doubled over gagging before they even crossed the threshold. What they saw within was not a household. It was something else entirely. 17 souls crammed into 4 narrow rooms, their faces pale from years without sunlight. Children crouched in corners, eyes wide and unfocused, rocking in rhythm with their own mutters. Some dragged themselves across the floor with twisted limbs, their joints unable to hold weight. A few stared straight ahead, never reacting to the intruders at all, as though they were already empty shells. The sounds were worse than the sight. Thin wails, shrill bursts of laughter with no joy behind them, and a strange babble that repeated syllables like fragments of an invented tongue. Linguists later studied recordings made in the days after the raid, concluding that the children had developed a private pidgin, a patchwork language formed out of isolation. But in the moment, to the deputies hearing it for the first time, it was a nightmare soundtrack they would never forget. Martha and Sarah stood at the center of the chaos, clutching rusted shotguns, their eyes wild. They shouted at the men to leave, shrieking about sacred trials and divine purity. Their hair was thin and gray, their faces sunken, but their voices carried the manic conviction of prophets. They had no fear left, only fanatic resolve. It took 3 men to wrench the weapons from their hands. Once the sisters were subdued, doctors began their work. They moved from child to child with flashlights and notebooks, their expressions tightening with every new observation. Malnutrition was evident in all, ribs jutting like fence posts, bellies distended with fluid, skin marred by sores left untreated for years. But alongside the hunger were deformities that defied explanation. One boy's spine twisted so severely that his chest collapsed inward, forcing every breath into a rasp. Another child's legs bent outward at grotesque angles, leaving her to crawl like an insect. A girl barely past toddler age flinched when a doctor lifted her, her bones fractured under the gentlest touch. Of the 11 surviving children, only 3 were judged capable of any real rehabilitation. The rest were considered too far gone, their bodies and minds shattered beyond recovery. In the back room, investigators uncovered belongings that painted an even darker picture. Not the crude genealogical sketches Robert Mills had described in his report, those were already known, but new notebooks filled with daily records. The handwriting alternated between the 2 sisters. Some pages read like farm logs, except the entries marked not livestock but children. There were notes on pairings, instructions for who was to share beds, and even ritualistic phrases describing tests of purity. Dates suggested these practices had been enforced for years, codified into routine. One page chilled the doctors more than any deformity, the union of J and M, fulfilled. Child weak but chosen. There was no hesitation in the words, no acknowledgement of tragedy. To Martha and Sarah, even the most broken births had been framed as victories. The notebooks were bagged as evidence, but the images of those pages haunted the men who handled them. Poverty could excuse hunger. Ignorance could excuse poor medicine. But planning, deliberate planning, transformed the Whitlock case into something far darker than neglect. It was not survival. It was design. When the children were finally carried out, bundled in coats and blankets, the convoy that escorted them down the mountain roads moved slowly. Locals had gathered by then, drawn by rumors of the raid. They watched in silence as pale faces peered from truck windows, some eyes blank, others wild. A few children shrieked when headlights hit them, recoiling as if the outside world itself burned. The silence among the onlookers was telling. No one asked questions. No one stepped forward. They simply stared as the caravan disappeared into the trees. Behind them, the cabin stood gutted, its doors broken, its windows gaping like sockets. Wind cut through the empty rooms, scattering loose papers across the floor. In the corner where the sisters had once stood with their shotguns, a lantern still flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to move even after the fire died. That night, the county believed the nightmare was over. The children were safe. The sisters were in custody. The cabin was empty. But as investigators sifted through the evidence in the weeks that followed, they uncovered truths darker than the raid itself, truths that suggested the Whitlock saga was not just a story of suffering, but a carefully maintained experiment in human ruin. The raid at the Whitlock cabin broke the family's grip on itself, but it did not undo the damage. 11 children were carried into the cold night, bundled in blankets, their eyes wide and confused. Doctors examined them in makeshift facilities nearby, writing notes that read less like medical records and more like grim inventories. The findings were devastating: bone diseases untreated, organs twisted in impossible ways, minds locked at infant stages. Only 3 were judged capable of even partial rehabilitation. The rest were too far gone. Blindness, deafness, brittle bones, and profound cognitive collapse left them unfit for ordinary care. They were placed in institutions, where most survived only a handful of years. For those who worked with them, the memory of their fragility lingered longer than the children themselves. Among them, one child endured. A girl identified later as Rebecca lived long enough to leave the hospital system and enter foster care. She learned to read, to write, to dress herself, and eventually to work quietly in a library far from the hollow. She never married. Never had children. In her own words, found in a letter written late in life, "It must end with me." She passed in her 40s, the last true descendant of the Whitlock line. Martha and Sarah were committed to a state asylum. They never admitted fault, never expressed regret. To their final days they insisted that the state had destroyed what God had built. Staff recalled them as inseparable, sitting side by side on benches, whispering prayers to each other as though the pact still bound them even after everything had collapsed. For the men who uncovered the cabin, the ordeal never faded. Deputies carried the smell with them for years. Some refused to speak of what they had seen. Robert Mills, whose inspection had first forced the state's hand, became a withdrawn man. He avoided children, drank heavily, and kept his original report hidden in his desk until his death. Other officials who had examined the children admitted quietly that their careers never felt the same afterward. The Whitlock case was buried in official silence. Newspapers printed only vague accounts, careful not to shock readers with details. Files were sealed in courthouse archives, unavailable to the public for decades. But within universities and medical schools, copies of the report circulated quietly. The case was presented not as sensationalism but as a chilling warning, how isolation, superstition, and unbroken bloodlines could create collapse more terrifying than any disease. In the Appalachian Hills, the silence around the family was heavier than gossip. Locals avoided the clearing where the cabin once stood. They did not tell ghost stories. They did not call it cursed ground. They simply refused to speak of it at all. To acknowledge it would be to remember that they had looked away for years. Silence was easier. By the 1960s the cabin was gone, its timbers rotted and scattered, its foundation swallowed by vines. Nothing visible remained, but the memory persisted. For those who knew the truth, the horror of the Whitlocks required no exaggeration. This is remembered not for superstition but because of what it revealed, that love can warp into obsession, that devotion can curdle into control, and that the greatest horrors are often the ones built patiently, generation by generation, inside a home that no one dared disturb.